Well, good morning, everybody. I'm glad to be here and glad to speak with you today. Wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the other end of the Florida Friendly Community side of the program, sort of what we're working on with green stormwater infrastructure, and really looking at how do we manage sort of water after it leaves the residential landscape or the lot level, and how do we manage it in our not just residential but also commercial and larger urban developments. Just give you an idea of sort of the overview. Get my controls here. Going to give you sort of just a brief intro to stormwater management for some of you that may not be as familiar with it, so that you understand sort of why we have been managing stormwater the way that you commonly see it, which will set up sort of the need for a bit of a paradigm shift with green stormwater infrastructure. I'm going to talk a little bit about the different practices that are commonly used with that approach. I'm going to give you sort of an overview of a resource that we have developed that is publicly available. It was made for Southeast Florida, but has a lot of linkages or application to this region, to the GTM region as well. But more importantly, it's sort of a basis that we're going to be building off of to expand more to a statewide level, and the products that will be coming out of this broader GSI education program that's in development right now. And then at the end, I hope that we'll have some time for hopefully have some questions from you guys, and I'll be able to hopefully be able to answer them all. So let's get into it. So just kind of starting off, when we look at sort of the range of land uses, we think about sort of undeveloped areas. The condition or the state of that area dictates sort of what happens to the water that falls on that area. Okay, so if we have a natural ground cover area, no impervious area, no concrete, no asphalt, no roofs, there's a lot of water that's going to be either infiltrating into the soil and then taken up and evapotranspirated by the plants and vegetation into the atmosphere, or that's going to infiltrate into the deeper groundwater with only a little bit of that water. In this case, just kind of a generalization here, 10% of that annual rainfall going to runoff. And just for perspective, this is generalized, but overall in this area, we get about 50 inches of rainfall per year. So you think about 10% of that, it's about 5 inches, not a whole lot from the undeveloped area. As we start to develop that area and we increase the amount of impervious area, we start to affect that water balance. So we start shifting that water from infiltrating and evaporating to more runoff. Okay, so we have, in this case, now we've dropped our infiltration to 42%, our evapotranspiration has dropped slightly, and our runoff is now 20%. We get into more what you would expect from a common residential development neighborhood. And now we're at, 35% is infiltrated, 35% is evaporated or evapotranspirated. And then we have runoff, which is about 30% of that. So now we're up to 15 inches of rainfall per year, maybe running off. And then in really highly densely urbanized areas, downtowns, you can kind of think of downtown Jacksonville or downtown Orlando, really highly impervious areas. We really shift that water balance drastically. Now we have, in this case, only about 15% of that water actually gets into recharging the groundwater or going in deep into the ground. 30% is evapotranspirated, and 55% of that water might be going to runoff. When we think about sort of the transition from natural ground cover to maybe residential, sort of 30 to 50% imperviousness, it might only seem like, well, we only have 20% more water that's going to runoff. That's 10 to 30%. But really, that's 3 times the amount of water that's going off that landscape and going into the receiving bodies, streams, lakes, estuaries, and so forth. But that's sort of on the overall water balance. But on like an individual storm event basis, there's also some significant changes that occur. So here we have the blue bars here represent sort of an incremental rainfall. We call it a hyetograph. But the response to that hyetograph is the runoff that comes from sort of what's happening on that landscape. So an undeveloped response to that might be demonstrated by this green curve, where we have a fairly low runoff volume. You understand that the volume under that green curve is much smaller than what's in the blue bars there. We also have sort of a delay in when that peak runoff occurs. And contrast that to what happens when we urbanize an area and we put in a lot of impervious cover, a lot of infrastructure, pipes. A lot of our approach to stormwater management has been to try to get water off site as quickly as possible. That has a lot of impacts. So we have a greater total runoff volume just by the introduction of impervious cover. We also have a shorter time to that peak runoff rate. So that creates more of a flashier response from the watershed, right? So it doesn't sort of hold that water and then slowly release it. We're getting it off as quickly as possible. Rain comes down hard, we get a flashy response. Higher peak runoff rates as well. So this has a lot of impacts with downstream flooding and potential channel erosion and some other impacts. Conventionally, again, our approach has been to get water off site as soon as possible. And we've been pretty efficient at doing that in many of our cases. All you have to do is look at a lot of our urban areas that were built sometime between any time before the 1980s, maybe in the 1970s and so forth. And you'll see a lot of this connectivity and see sort of where, if you look for it, you'll see sort of the connections where we're essentially trying to get water off site from the rooftops or the sidewalks, the streets, into storm drains, into stormwater pipes, and as quickly as possible into the nearest water body to take that water on. It's very efficient, prevents sort of on-site flooding very well. But it has a lot of impacts that to our water bodies. For one thing, we're carrying a lot of pollutants off that site, and we can have impacts on sort of the ecology of the system. In the upper left, we have a fish kill. It's occurred because too many nutrients. Algal bloom has basically consumed a lot of the dissolved oxygen, and fish died. We have also issues with downstream flooding or not having enough capacity in our storm drain system to manage all of the heavy rains that causes localized flooding. We have channel incision in certain areas. This is sort of honestly, it used to be a small farm that got turned into an apartment complex. So it was a very narrow channel, about 5 feet wide, and now it's more like about 15 feet deep. And then you've probably seen sort of over the years in this area, algal blooms that occur, well, all over the state, but this one specifically came from the St. Johns River at one point, where we have excess nutrients, and that can be transported by stormwater runoff coming from urban landscapes. We did notice sort of over time that stormwater needed to be managed differently, and particularly the issues of flooding and channel incision and flow control. And so this is sort of the approach that's kind of been taken in what we see much across the state. And so we have back to our sort of our rainfall event here. We have our developed runoff curve, but we've changed it a little bit. And one of the design aspects is to kind of capture that increased runoff and then slowly release it. So we have our sort of pre-developed runoff curve. We see the peak of that runoff from this rainstorm. And that's what this yellow dotted line is basically. That's sort of our pre-developed rate of water kind of running off of this watershed. And instead of having just water going off as quickly as it's produced with our developed runoff, we have this peak controlled developed runoff. And so essentially what's happened is that we've taken that large peak that comes from a developed runoff, and we're kind of stretching it out so that it doesn't exceed that dotted line here, this pre-developed peak. This is basically implementing detention. And so we see this implemented throughout the state in a lot of stormwater ponds. So with detention, we have kind of the same stormwater volume. We're not really necessarily reducing it. We are reducing the peak rate. And we're also contributing downstream stability that's being improved. But across the state, we've mapped somewhere on the order of 75,000 urban stormwater ponds that are around the state of Florida. It takes up somewhere around 2% of the state's land area. And so it's the most common way that we've managed stormwater, and several reasons that we do that, or that it's been done that way. The conventional approach to development is to, again, kind of following, let's get water off-site of the source area, whether that's sort of the rooftops, the roadways, the landscape, and get that into a stormwater drainage network. Okay, and so water gets off the streets into the storm drain. In many cases, that's sort of out of sight, out of mind for most folks. That water then oftentimes will go through that stormwater collection system into a stormwater pond, where it has three functions that it's expected to perform. The first one is flood control. Okay, so we want to make sure that when we have a heavy rain event, all that runoff isn't going all the way downstream and flooding our neighbors. All right, we're also controlling that flow rate. Okay, so that we don't have it as we're mitigating that flashiness that can occur from urbanization. But then there's the water quality volume aspect here, where it's expected to treat and remove nutrients for water quality protection, and removing those nutrients that might be coming from the urban landscape and going into our receiving waters. More on that in a moment. But when we look at sort of the rainfall, if we consider what these ponds are designed to manage from a flood control and a peak flow control, they're designed to meet some pretty large storm events. So for example, we look at sort of the 25-year, 24-hour event. This is a major storm event, a major flood event, maybe caused by a hurricane that comes through. Maybe it's just a really intense front that comes through. But it's something that would be expected to happen once every 25 years. That's a one way to put it, but it has sort of a 4% chance of happening any given year. But this size storm, we're talking about 10 inches of rainfall. That's a lot of water. And that's what these stormwater ponds are typically designed to manage and control the flood and detain for. So for example, here, we're looking at sort of this 25-year return period, 24 hours, 10 inches. Sometimes we're looking at sort of the 100-year storm events. It doesn't seem like it's much bigger, but it makes a big difference when you go from 10 to 13 to 15 and so forth. But the reality, how often do those storms occur? It's not that often. We don't have that happening every year or even multiple times a year, in most cases. When we talk about water quality from urban landscapes, there's several places that the pollutants kind of originate from. We have a lot of the urban roadways where we get metals and PAHs that might come from. You might see sort of street sweepers coming through your neighborhood or in the urban areas, taking up sediments, picking up organic debris. That's basically removing that material that would eventually get washed in storm events into nearby waterways or into our water bodies. We have the potential for nutrients to come from our landscapes. Even if we're applying fertilizer correctly, we might have some nutrients that do kind of get exported from that landscape, but more so if we aren't careful enough to prevent fertilizer from getting on impervious surface and so forth. And I love my dog. My dog is not this cute, but they are a walking, barking point source of pollution, essentially, where they basically put out nitrogen and phosphorus, as well as pathogens. And those can be exported from the landscape into our waterways. Coming back to stormwater ponds, I mentioned that there's an assumption, essentially, that these ponds manage or meet nutrient removal expectations. They're credited, if they're built based on the state designs, with removing 80% of nitrogen or phosphorus. However, what we kind of see in some of the research, whether it's kind of looking at the concentrations or the overall mass removal, they're not really reaching that level, particularly for nitrogen. So our concentrations coming in tend to be on the order of 1.6 milligrams of nitrogen, with the outflow getting down to 1.2. We're only really getting there. That comes out to be about 25–30% maybe. With phosphorus, it's much better. We get 35.35 milligrams down to 0.11. We're getting up closer to 67%. With the removal efficiencies, though, we kind of see that with the mass of nitrogen, even if we have a very long duration that water is held in this lower left figure, that blue line, which kind of shows the relationship between time that water's held and the amount of nitrogen removed, really doesn't get above 40%, but except for very long holding times, and never gets close to that 80%. Phosphorus, we can get 80% if it's held for long enough. And so there's some legacy effects of this in the way that we've done stormwater management. And so we kind of need a little bit of a paradigm shift. You know, how big a problem is stormwater runoff into our water bodies? Well, if we look at it from a national perspective, it's the second leading cause of impairment for coastlines, and second leading cause for bays and estuaries, fifth for streams and rivers, and eighth for lakes. If we look just here at Florida, we see that the impairment rate for those bodies are shown here. 31% of our coastlines are impaired or not basically meeting their water quality expectations. 59% are impaired of our bays and estuaries, 55% streams and rivers, and 80% of lakes. And if we look closely at sort of, you know, what the actual impairments are within Florida, we see that several of these are related back to stormwater sources. Nutrients, algal growth, and low oxygen is #1 for coastlines and bays and estuaries here in Florida. Second for streams and rivers. Lakes is third. Pathogens, which can come from bacteria, that either from natural sources or pets, can be transported by stormwater runoff, and that is third, seventh, third, and second. And that's just so far. And so if we look at sort of a map of state of Florida, this is sort of looking at what the development was in 2010 on your left. See all the red areas. And then if you contrast that with the areas that are essentially impaired, basically not meeting their water quality goals, that's sort of the gray regions. And then the blue outlined areas and the brown outlined areas are areas that are kind of have that water quality improvement plan, a TMDL plan, basically in development, where they're determining the sources of the pollutants. And then the basin management action plan has been implemented in all the areas that are green. But I think if you look closely, you should see that there's a lot of overlap between those TMDLs adopted, the blue outlined areas, and the gray areas where they haven't gotten to that stage yet, and where our urban areas are as well. So there's a lot of correlation between urban areas and the impact or status of our water resources. And I love that this kind of error kind of pops up sometimes when I'm trying to look for areas that are impaired or determining what the pollution source is, and that the layer with the water's not attaining standards did not draw completely because there's too much information to kind of show. It's sort of a kind of a wake-up call in some ways, or it's kind of an indication of the extent of the problem that we are dealing with. So kind of coming back to the rainfall events and sort of the size of storms that we're managing. If we were to look at sort of the rainfall distribution, you know, what's the size of the storm that typically happens on a regular basis? You know, you probably think about it, you know, if you think about it, you probably figure that, you know, they're on a regular basis, you know, they're not really big storms. We don't have like major flood events, hopefully, on a regular basis, unless there's some confounding factor, okay? So for example, you know, looking at the rainfall here, I think this is out of Tampa, but the rainfall distribution is very similar for the St. Augustine area and the Jacksonville area. 85% of the days that had rainfall were less than an inch. And so when we think about sort of that 10-inch rainfall event, that's getting up to where we have less than 1% of storm events are that large. So that's what these stormwater ponds are designed for. But really what we're concerned about is these small, regular occurring rainfall events. So the regularly occurring small events that wash the pollutants off the land surface and into these stormwater ponds that essentially are shown that they're not really meeting our water quality expectations. So this is where the green stormwater infrastructure comes into play. The idea here is that we're integrating more function of managing stormwater into the overall landscape. And it becomes more of a planning approach because it really needs to start at sort of the initial design phase rather than just being sort of as the project is being developed. It needs to be sort of a critical element within that design process. And so instead of the runoff from the lots in the street going directly into a stormwater inlet, we look to how can we make that the functional space of the landscape have more of a stormwater impact, have more of a function with retaining that water, treating it, improving it. And some of that water might be treated and then go into the stormwater collection system, but essentially we're getting our water quality treatment here in the landscape before it goes into that that stormwater collection system. This is basically managing this non-point source of pollution at the source. And that way, the stormwater pond can just function as flood control and peak flow control for those large events. When we think about sort of the definition, low impact development, green stormwater infrastructure, there's a lot of different terms out there. Probably my favorite one, and unfortunately it's not here in the US, is, and I forget what it stands for. It's basically SQUIDS, Sustainable Storm Quality Impact Design or something like that. I think it's out of Europe. But anyway, there's a lot of different terminology that's used and thrown around. But we've been going with green stormwater infrastructure because it's kind of a term that has kind of captures a lot of what the intent of the practices are and sort of the aspects of them. So I like this definition that comes from the Alachua County Unified Land Development Code here. And so GSI, which typically was referred to as low impact development or LID, is a site design strategy. So it's not just a practice. It's a site design strategy for maintaining or replicating the pre-development hydrologic regime, not necessarily the whole balance, but at least that sort of regime, through the use of design techniques that create a functionally equivalent hydrologic landscape. All right, so we're trying to reintroduce the functions of the natural landscape into the developed landscape. These hydrologic functions of storage, infiltration, groundwater recharge, remember that back to the water balance pie chart, plus discharge volume and frequency are maintained by integrated and distributed micro-scale stormwater retention and detention areas, reduction of impervious surfaces, and the lengthening of flow paths and runoff times. So we're not as, lengthening the runoff time, that kind of gets at addressing the flashings. Other GSI strategies include, but are not limited to, the preservation of environmentally sensitive site features, such as natural upland habitat, wetlands, wetland buffers, and floodplains. These are valuable resources that are in an undeveloped site, should be protected and utilized to benefit the overall, to buffer the impacts of urbanization. So let me go over some of the, kind of going through some of the strategies here as we get into what GSI kind of really is in the implementation. We're looking at limiting imperviousness, and there's ways that this can be done at the design stage. We have shorter driveways, as we see here, smaller lots going to more dense construction or vertical construction. We're limiting the roof area, but also narrowing streets and having swales. There's sometimes issues that come up where local governments, we may need to look at some of our codes, do what's called an ordinance audit, and look at, are there requirements, such as requirements for curb and gutter, that might impede the implementation of GSI strategies or this kind of development. Looking at ways to allow that, permit the use of these strategies without inhibiting it. Disconnecting imperviousness is a really valuable strategy. You think about it, if we have a connected imperviousness, if we go from rooftop to driveway, to street, to stormwater inlet, to storm pipe, into pond, there's no point along that flow path where water has the potential to even go back into the ground. Its fate is sealed once it hits that rooftop about where it's going to go. Disconnecting that impervious cover by allowing street runoff to go into swales or pervious areas or into rain gardens, disconnects and provides that opportunity for water to go into the ground. And a lot of times this can be implemented in a lot of sort of common areas. You think about, you may have seen this in some cases in parking lots, where instead of having a raised median or a raised island between parking rows, maybe it's depressed, where it has sort of different types of grasses or different types of vegetation, so that water funnels into that, is captured, pollutants are kind of retained there, and then excess water might flow over and go into the larger stormwater management system. Bioretention and rain gardens are probably one of, if not the most common implementation of green stormwater infrastructure. Usually these are kind of, as I was referring to just a moment ago, vegetated depressional areas, and essentially these recover that storage either by infiltration, or they may have an underdrain if the soils are more clayey or don't perk as well, or if there's a high water table. There still can be some benefits of treatment as that water flows through that vegetation and soil and is then discharged. Typically, we want to make sure that these recover that stormwater runoff that it captures within about 24 hours, so that we don't end up having sort of a nuisance, or basically a mosquito breeding area. Traffic islands and medians, as I referred to there, these can look, take a wide range of looks and aesthetics. Sometimes they use curb cuts, as you see in the lower left, where this was basically a retrofit. This used to be sort of a parking aisle, or sort of a median or an island here. Came in, excavated that island, put in some curb cuts, and now we're intercepting stormwater and retaining some of those pollutants that would be coming off that roadway. You really have a wide selection of plants that can maintain and kind of bring aesthetic quality to the landscape where they're put in place. Or you can go with grass as well. That can also be just a typically easy to maintain, or at least not having more difficult to maintain, or having more knowledge to maintain the turf grass, depending on your land use. But islands are a great way to implement rain gardens and disconnecting imperviousness. Permeable pavements, these are probably one of my favorite practices. If you've seen porous concrete, you may have seen it and may not have even known it. It looks like, it's basically just like concrete, but it has sort of the fine particles taken out of that mixture. So you end up having these interlocked aggregate that is cemented together. And it's usually 3 to 4 inches thick. But if you see it in the wild, so to speak, you'll know it because it looks like, up close, it looks like a Rice Krispie treat. So keep an eye out for that. Porous asphalt kind of looks the same. It's oftentimes really difficult to kind of tell porous asphalt from regular asphalt. But then you have concrete pavers or permeable pavers. These pavers allow water basically to flow through small gaps in between the pavers. And the rate that water flows through these pavements is so high when it's new that we'll often recommend that you can put 5 times the amount of drainage area can go to that pervious area without, as long as you have enough storage underneath. And underneath there, it's usually a rock bed that's basically doesn't have any fine materials, because that will basically clog up some of the subsoil. The water flows rapidly into that subsurface and then is held at the soil surface while it slowly percolates into that surrounding subsoil. We do have sort of an EDIS fact sheet if you'd like to kind of look into that a little bit more. Kind of goes through sort of a lot of the technical considerations there. Some other practices here we look at are infiltration trenches or dry wells. Essentially, looking at ways to get that water rapidly conveyed into a large volume of storage, and then let it soak into the ground around it. This is really great for rooftop runoff. And if it's getting surface runoff, you want to make sure that you're not getting sediments or fine particles into there, because that will clog up the infiltrating surface along that storage volume. So it's, in that case, it would be critical to have some pre-treatment, something that's going to remove those particles. Cisterns, we've probably all seen a lot of these. These can be above ground or below ground. The key with implementing cisterns is that there is a regular recovery of that volume or use that's going to be used. So this might be irrigation, vehicle washing, toilets, anything along those lines, anything that's non-potable at this point. Rain barrels are basically a smaller scale version of those. And it's important to think that, it's not just one practice or the other, that there's a lot of this a lot of these practices can be implemented across a development scale or across a site. So helping those decision makers, whether they're local governments or property owners, to understand that there are opportunities throughout a development space to implement stormwater management, green stormwater infrastructure. That's a big key point. And if we see sort of another example here, this is a apartment development here in Gainesville, actually, where they have sort of the stormwater pond that you can see in the background. That's for sort of the flood control, sort of a regional structure that's basically taking runoff from a lot of different areas, not just this apartment complex. But they've integrated at the complex porous concrete, which you see in the right figures, and pervious pavers that you see in the left upper left corner that we're standing on. But then underneath the porous concrete is basically a cistern system where they have these huge vaults where they capture that water, and then they use that for irrigation to water plants in the landscape around there. So it's a really fascinating point. One of the things to be careful about is that with stormwater management is in areas with high groundwater, we want to be careful about not having too much, not over infiltrating our stormwater so that we have basically a groundwater mounding that occurs. If we're too shallow, then we can have basically water just build up vertically, and it takes a lot longer for that water to basically to dissipate laterally. With sea level rise is another aspect that we have to kind of consider, and I know that St. Augustine has some issues with sunny day flooding, where water is essentially the seawater is rising and backing up maybe through the storm drainage system, but this is kind of the function that can occur in these areas. So what we have in this case, just the data that we see from Daytona Beach shores, sort of the nearest point that I could find some data for this region. Right now, we're looking at somewhere between 5 and 20 inches of sea level rise in that area. And so what that means is, there's going to be more frequent events of water coming up through the drainage system and basically getting up into our open areas where the inlets are. And that can cause a lot of problems with saltwater contamination or saltwater getting into areas. I kind of want to just move on a little bit now to the Southeast Florida manual as a resource, and I think Caitlin's going to drop a link to this in the chat. And I bring this up because we don't have, for the GSI education program, we don't have a manual to show you yet. We're in the process of developing that. But there's a lot of elements and features of this manual that we developed for Southeast Florida back in 2019 that I think we found were beneficial, and that we're going to implement and expand on and build upon with the next resources. So in this case, we were sort of looking at specific context of Southeast Florida, kind of Martin to Dade County, Miami-Dade County, and really taking into account sort of the resources there. And in this case, we were particularly concerned about land-based sources of pollution and the effects that they might have on the coral reef system there. We wanted to account for understanding, what is the land use and land cover type that is in these counties, and then understanding sort of the drainage network. Things are a little bit different in South Florida. You could say that for a lot of things, but it's a little bit different in South Florida with the hydrology, the slopes, the way that they have canals kind of going everywhere. But essentially, we did tailor this to that region. But I think several things can be translated beyond. So the purpose here was to basically inform both public and private entities, so local governments, local government officials, consultants, private land developers, so that they had sort of knowledge and the information to make decisions about what is green stormwater infrastructure, how do I go about implementing it, what do I need to consider. So we look at sort of the impacts of development on pollutant exports. We provided sort of a framework for incorporating these techniques into projects, and we wanted to make sure that we emphasize sort of the co-benefits of GSI or LID to community and health. One thing this does include is design considerations, but it is not a full-blown design manual. So that's an important thing there. Kind of just looking at the manual organization, we start out with sort of an introduction. We go over the local environmental context, site planning, the plan for different stormwater control measures. And in this case, we were using the term low impact development, interchangeable with GSI, green stormwater infrastructure, and looking at sort of what those practices are so that you have a description and understanding of what those different practices are. Then there's sort of the process of assessing the applicability of the candidate SCMs. The operation and maintenance is a key aspect of making sure that they continue to perform over their lifetime. We also have some information on public education, community benefits, and conclusions and next steps. Just kind of give you sort of a conceptual approach here that we found works pretty well, or kind of tends to communicate the process fairly well, is to, number one, identify the project and find the problem. So we start up here at the top. Then that leads into sort of your site planning. So the overlying aspect here is that GSI design is an integrated process with the overall design, site design process. So we look at the site planning and really looking at what the constraints and what the site offers, from what your intended land use is, water quality, what is your soils condition, what's your water table condition, and looking at how it integrates with the surrounding hydrology and landscape. Then we look at sort of the fundamental sort of water quality treatment processes. We're looking at high flow through and into these systems, looking at physical treatment process like particles that are removed, or filtration, or disinfection that needs to occur, chemical processes and biological processes. So this oftentimes applies to nutrients that are being transformed, or disinfection that might occur as well in some different ways. Then once you have sort of the understanding of the processes that each type of practice can provide, then you sort of identify what your site needs to be able to maintain, consider those options for stormwater control, and then assess the applicability of those candidate options. So that means taking into account what are the physical, social, and legal constraints. What are the preliminary, you can do a preliminary performance assessment. How well is each one going to be able to use or remove those pollutants? And then relative cost benefits for those different SCMs. So after you've done that, then you can select which ones to implement on your site and follow the different sizing methodologies and adaptive designs. So kind of the local environmental context, that really kind of comes into play here with the hydrology and geology of the area. What's the climate? We get about 50 inches of rain up here. I think down there, once you're getting closer to 60 inches of rain. The timing during the year of when rainfall comes is different. And there's other regulatory aspects that need to be accounted for from different water management districts, different municipalities, and accounting for that. And then also understanding the causes and the drivers for impairment, or water bodies that are not meeting their water, their intended water use. Site planning, a lot of this comes into trying to think about how are we going to do site clearing, grading, how do we avoid compaction? It's another sort of side area that I work in, but looking at how do we mitigate compaction of soils in new developments, because those areas are meant to infiltrate and hopefully have sort of some water retaining potential there. How are we going to avoid and maintain old growth trees and keep that as a resource? So that comes into site planning. Then planning for SCMs. A lot of this comes into looking at how do we integrate these types of practices into the overall design of the development. This is sort of an example where on the left was the traditional design for this larger development. And they came back and basically proposed, we don't want to impact these wetlands that are on the west side of the property. So basically came back and did a lot more intensive compact design, fewer impacts on the wetlands, more vertical design, and we're able to address stormwater in the designs aspect. Then we get into sort of the different types of stormwater control measures. There's lots of different kind of ways to categorize these and looking at their sort of functions, sort of, the general structural design criteria, how much volume needs to be captured and retained. What are our structural stormwater control measures, whether it's flow control, flow through, We have a lot of different aspects that are considered within that resource. And then when we're looking at assessing the applicability of the SCMs, consider the different types of land use. There are different types of practices that are better situated for those types of land uses. For example, permeable pavement. I love it dearly just because you can park on it and you get your stormwater management underneath it, and it's kind of like a 2-for-1. However, when it comes to evaluating the cost, it's not going to work for our where areas where land costs are low. There's going to be other practices that are going to win out and be more cost effective and still be able to meet the performance and the goals of the overall development. We also want to see how these SCMs integrate into the landscape. Another resource that we came up with was this sort of BMP Matrix that essentially tries to put a lot of these considerations together so that someone who's developing an area can make a comparison or kind of look at the different trade-offs between going with certain types of SCMs. And I think that Caitlin might have a link to that as well. But we look at sort of the benefits that are provided, where we're looking at volume, flow through, what type of pollutants are removed, look at how applicable it is to the site, those types of constraints, and then some long-term implementation considerations there. So that's a nice resource that has applicability elsewhere. We also talk about operation and maintenance. One of my favorite quotes is that everyone wants to build, no one wants to maintain, from Kurt Vonnegut. And these are just like, Claire provided a great sort of case study looking at sort of the difference between conventional sort of landscaping and Florida-friendly landscaping, and really kind of looking at what's the maintenance comparison here. So anything that we put in place, we have to maintain so that it continues to perform. And there's a lot of ways that we can kind of look at these practices and quickly make an assessment of whether they are performing well, or more intensive maintenance needs to be implemented. Public education and ancillary community benefits are also a feature here that we want to include, because the community is going to be interacting or be around these areas, and they need to understand what the function is and participate and understand the benefits to, maybe it's not just what's happening locally with that green infrastructure to habitat, but maybe it's protecting habitat downstream, and how, when we're asking folks to basically pick up after their pets, why is that? What is the motivator there? They need to understand through education they can do that. Moving on to sort of kind of closing out here as far as our education program and where we're at. We kicked off this program back in October, and we've basically been focusing primarily on sort of this task 1 that I'll kind of go into, but we've broken it up into basically 5 different tasks that will happen over the next, essentially through the end of 2022. So the first thing that we're focusing on is kind of doing a needs assessment and evaluating what resources are available to the professionals or the technical audience out there, the people who are making decisions. What resources do they need? And so this involves kind of looking at what manuals are available or educational resources are available from around the state, but also looking beyond Florida and looking at some of the resources that are available from outside the state. We're then going to be working with several folks who are in Springs area to develop a manual for karst areas, so that we can protect or kind of mitigate the impact of stormwater that can cause impairment on our springs. We'll also be looking at developing a statewide GSI sort of manual, more of like a template that local communities can follow and tailor to their local situation. And then the task 4 will be actually holding workshops and trainings around the state. And I know it shows that it starts in January of this year, or is kind of going on right now, but this is really kind of looking more towards the end of 2021 and early 2022. And then we have sort of a final report to kind of bring everything together. But there will be a website that kind of houses a lot of this public education materials as well. Just kind of to touch on the phase 1 needs assessment. We're looking at just what's here in Florida, several manuals, Escambia County, Pinellas, Alachua. They have resources that we can pull from, but there's other states that have really great manuals and great resources and other types of green infrastructure that maybe we aren't using as much in Florida. One of the main ones we looked at was actually out of Western Washington. They have some really innovative ideas with how to integrate green infrastructure. We're also about to release sort of a needs assessment survey to the stormwater professionals. So we'll be asking basically public works consultants, anyone who's working in the stormwater area. We're going to try and get the link to that survey out to you so that you can provide feedback and help better inform these resources as we go through developing them. The CARS manual, as I mentioned, we're working with a focus group or a stakeholder group, but we'll be also working with water management districts and the communities who are centrally in those karst areas or sensitive groundwater areas. We'll have a design guidance for common practices, and we'll go through a couple drafts with them before it's finalized. The statewide stormwater guidance, again, this is kind of going to build off of the Southeast Florida manual, but trying to go deeper with providing some design guidance for some of the most common types of practices that professionals need. So not just having sort of here's a bioretention and what it typically looks like, but here's the design process. Here are some design templates that can be pulled for, some designs that can be pulled for in your design process. We'll be having sort of a design matrix and also providing guidance on the operation and maintenance of the manuals, of those practices as well. And then phase 4, we'll have 14 workshops. I think tentatively we kind of had in mind that we would have 2 in each of the DEP districts around the state. We'll see how that kind of works out with COVID. A lot of that might be sort of virtual workshops like this, but we're planning to start that later this year, and that'll follow through to into 2022. We'll have a recording of the workshops and make that available on the website, so that'll be available to anyone at any time. And then just want to touch on a couple of resources. One of them I mentioned, the permeable pavement technical considerations. We have the links there. But we also have, if you're interested in finding out more about some of these specific GSI practices, I work with a colleague, Mark Clark, to kind of do sort of an introduction on a lot of these different practices. If you have sort of somebody that's interested in maybe doesn't know much about GSI, but they're in a position to make decisions about that, maybe a local official, these might be a good resource for you to pass along to them so that they have sort of at least a cursory understanding of sort of what they do, how they function in landscape, what their benefits and constraints are. And so with that, I will sort of yield to the group and sort of see if there are any questions that we might have from the audience.
Absolutely. Thank you, Evan. I'm looking forward to the stormwater guidance resource that is to come. So we do have, I see Vicki, your physical hand is raised. If you want to come off of mute and ask your question.
Thank you, Dr. Bean. This looks like an exciting program. And it makes a lot of sense in terms of new development. And we certainly have a fair amount of that in St. Johns County. Sure. But I'm curious to know, and maybe you haven't gotten to this point yet, about retrofitting possibility, whether there are benefits. And specifically, with reference to my own development, I mean, we have this huge retention pond that's aerated and it has fish in it, and they call it a lake, and it's like a prime real estate. And so I don't think that I could convince our folks to adopt pieces of this approach if it would undermine the traditional approach. So I don't know if you've thought about that and whether there really are retrofitting possibilities, but I would encourage you to think about that.
Yeah, absolutely, Vicki. You bring up a great point. A lot of this kind of is focused with the context of newer development. However, the designs that we are going to be implementing and the resources will be applicable to retrofitting as well. A lot of times, you have a lot more constraints with retrofitting. Whereas, where is the stormwater coming from? You have to kind of basically incorporate within the site's overall drainage as it is. So that's, one of the most common retrofits we see are sort of these rain garden or bioretention cells that are curb cuts. That's kind of a lot of times what we see with municipalities. In residential landscapes, it gets a little bit more tricky because you're dealing with a lot of private land. You do have sort of the community areas. So there may be opportunities there. We do have, just from enhancing the functionality of stormwater ponds. I didn't include this because it is tangential. It's a little bit tangential, but IFAS is I've been on a team that's developed this Healthy Ponds program. And we've just had sort of the first rollout of that. Abby Tierna, who's out of Sarasota County, we just did that back in the fall. And we're going to be expanding that to other parts of the state here in the first part of this year. But we're kind of trying to roll it out to statewide, kind of incrementally. The focus of that program is to help pond managers understand the functionality of their pond and how to keep their performance up using ecological principles, rather than just, for example, spraying algicide on the surface so that anytime you have an algal bloom, it just kind of drops out and turns the water blue for a while. We're looking at more holistic approaches. You think about a stormwater pond, and the analogy that I like to use is, and I get this from Abby, is, it's a lot like a fish tank. You want to find that ecological balance in the stormwater pond so that it's taking up the nutrients on a regular basis. You've got healthy air that's in the water for the fish and other organisms to live there. And one of the aspects that we also promote is planting of littoral zones and the area, the buffer zone, the 10 feet right up against the pond. So those may be some sort of low-hanging fruit to improve or enhance stormwater ponds in local communities. When it gets into the actually changing the infrastructure, we start looking at, digging up islands, common areas, cutting into concrete and so forth. Then we start looking into, more major infrastructure projects. And that, I don't know if your community is ready to take that on. You kind of brought up a point that may not be what they're willing to do yet. But there are some ways that you can strategically do that, depending on sort of what your community has to offer.
Okay, thank you. But I would encourage you, when you go around and do these workshops, to maybe have a piece that speaks to what are reasonable things that existing communities might be able to do that would adopt some of these to complement the traditional approach.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Vicki. Do we have any additional questions for Dr. Bean? Hey, Jen, absolutely. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
All right. Hey, good morning, Dr. Bean. Thank you. That was a fantastic presentation. A lot of really great information there. The question that I have is, so as you mentioned, the stormwater ponds are currently presumed to reduce nutrient volume by 80%. And what we're finding is that they're not in a lot of cases. And also, I know that there's some concern about the way that the pre-development and post-development loading is measured. So my question is, do you think that an 80% reduction is the best way to be measuring the efficiency of a stormwater system? Or is there another metric that you think makes more sense for a target, like a volume of nutrient output?
Well, I think the overall goal, the gold standard would be that whatever is coming off of the pre-developed landscape, that your post-developed landscape and your stormwater control measures, however they're integrated into that development, the output of those is the same. That you don't, when we talk about a forested area, we might think that is pristine and everything, but there are nutrients that come off of there. It's a lot lower than sort of an urban area. Don't get me wrong. but it's also like not negligible. There's a certain amount that comes out. So I think that is the intended target for a lot of our water quality treatment that's being done. So for example, the analogy you might take is, okay, 20% is not being removed. Well, that 20%, whatever that mass is, that should not exceed what was coming off of that landscape before it was developed. So that's so if that's sort of the way that it's done, then I think that is achieving sort of the intent of that metric. Now there's some of that may be changing. I'm not necessarily real sure on how the technical advisory committee, the TAC, what the long-term sort of outputs and impacts of that, the stormwater TAC that's looking at changing stormwater rules around for the state potentially, what that's going to entail. But one of their charges is to basically implement a lot of the green infrastructure into how do we do that in our regulatory system. So I hope that I answered it, maybe in a roundabout way, but hopefully I answered it for you.
Yeah, thank you.